The Galactic Concord had kept peace for 12,000 years, and every species in the known galaxy believed this peace would last forever because they had forgotten what war truly meant. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood before the massive crystalline window of her diplomatic quarters and stared at the alien stars that surrounded the Concord's central station where she had lived for 3 long years. Trying to make the galaxy listen to humanity, she was tired in a way that sleep could not fix, and her dark eyes carried the weight of countless failed negotiations and broken promises and meetings that led nowhere. The Concord was supposed to be a place of fairness and justice where all species could find help and protection, but Elena had learned that the Concord only protected those who had been members for thousands of years, while newcomers like humanity were treated as unwelcome guests at a party. They had not been invited to humanity, had joined the galactic community only 50 years ago when their first faster-than-light ship had stumbled into Concord space and shocked every alien species that encountered them. The aliens had immediately classified humans as Deathworlders, which was a term they used for any species that evolved on a planet that should have killed them. Earth was a nightmare world by galactic standards, with gravity that crushed bones and radiation that burned flesh and weather that destroyed cities and predators that hunted in every environment. From the deepest oceans to the highest mountains, most species in the Concord came from gentle worlds with stable climates and low gravity and no natural predators, and they looked at humans the way humans might look at creatures that crawled out of a volcano. The Department of Defense, which everyone called the DOD, was the military arm of the Concord, and they watched humanity with careful, suspicious eyes because they did not trust any species that had survived what Earth threw at its children. Admiral Vethcon was the commander of the DOD, and he was a crystalline being whose body was made of living mineral that sparkled like diamonds in the light. He had lived for over 2,000 years, and he had seen many species join the Concord. But none of them had disturbed him the way humans did, because when he looked into their eyes, he saw something that his species had lost long ago. He saw predators. Elena had spent 3 years trying to negotiate mining rights in the Kepler Expanse, which was a region of space rich with minerals that Earth desperately needed for its growing colonies. Every proposal she made was delayed or dismissed or buried under mountains of bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed to exhaust her patience. She had learned to smile when she wanted to scream, and to speak softly when she wanted to shout, and to bow her head when she wanted to fight. But everything changed when the colony ship Horizon Stream was destroyed. The Horizon Stream had been carrying 40,000 human settlers to a new world in the outer regions of Concord-protected space. Families had been aboard that ship, including children who had never known Earth and only dreamed of the new home that awaited them. The ship had sent a distress signal that lasted only seconds before it went silent forever, and when rescue vessels arrived, they found only debris floating in the cold. Darkness between stars. Elena had demanded an investigation, and the DOD had promised to look into the matter, but weeks passed, and then months, and every time she asked for updates, she received the same polite, empty responses. The incident was under investigation, and they would inform her when they had results, and she should be patient because these things took time. But Elena was not patient because 40,000 of her people were dead, and no one seemed to care. She used every contact she had made in 3 years of diplomatic work, and slowly she began to piece together the truth that the DOD was hiding. The attack on the Horizon Stream had not been an accident or a random act of piracy. The ship had been destroyed by the Vreth Consortium, which was a powerful species that had been part of the Concord for 8,000 years and controlled vast territories near the Kepler Expanse. The Vreth did not want humans expanding into space that they considered theirs, even though they had no legal claim to the region, and so they had simply eliminated the problem in the most direct way possible. The DOD knew this because their sensors had detected Vreth weapon signatures in the debris field. But they had buried the evidence because prosecuting a senior Concord member would create political instability. Elena had stood in Admiral Vefkan's office and placed the evidence on his desk and demanded justice for her people. The crystalline Admiral had looked at her with eyes that held no warmth and told her that the Concord's stability was more important than the lives of 40,000 colonists from a species that had only been part of the galactic community for half a century. He told her that humanity should learn to accept losses quietly if they wanted to survive in a galaxy that did not care about them. Elena had felt something break inside her at that moment, and it was not her spirit, but rather her faith in the system. She had spent 3 years trying to work within. She requested permission to address the full Concord Assembly, and it was granted because the Concord believed in the appearance of fairness even when fairness itself was absent. The assembly chamber was vast and filled with representatives from over 300 species, and Elena stood at the central podium. Feeling very small and very alone, she spoke for 1 hour and she presented every piece of evidence she had gathered, and she asked the assembly to do what was right and to punish those who had murdered innocent people. When she finished, there was silence, and then the assembly voted. The vote was not even close because species that had been friends with the Wrath for thousands of years were not going to condemn them for killing beings they considered barely civilized newcomers. Elena's petition was denied and the matter was declared closed, and she was thanked for her passion, but reminded that the Concord had procedures that must be respected. She walked out of that chamber with her head held high, but her heart was cold and hard like iron that had been forged in fire. She returned to Earth on the next transport, and when she stood before the United Defense Council, she spoke only 4 words that would change the course of galactic history. Mercy has failed us. The council members looked at each other, and they understood what she meant because they were humans and they had evolved on a world that taught them one simple truth. When diplomacy fails, the predator awakens. The United Defense Council met in a bunker deep beneath the Swiss Alps, where the rock was ancient and the silence was absolute, and no alien sensor could penetrate. 12 men and women sat around a table that had seen humanity through 3 world wars and countless crises, and now it would see them through something far greater than any challenge they had faced before. General Marcus Stone was the chairman, and he was a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who did not believe in soft edges. He had fought in the Mars Uprising and the Luna Crisis, and he had buried more soldiers than he could remember, but he had never felt the cold fury that burned in his chest as he listened to Ambassador Vasquez describe what the Concord had done. When she finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment, and then Stone leaned forward and placed his weathered hands flat on the table. "We cannot match them in numbers," he said, because his voice was calm and measured even though his eyes were not. "The Concord has 10,000 warships, and we have perhaps 200 that could survive a real fight, and even our best vessels are toys compared to what they can build with 12,000 years of technological advancement." Admiral Sarah Chun, who commanded Earth's fleet, nodded slowly because she knew the truth of his words better than anyone. "We cannot win a conventional war," she agreed, "but perhaps we do not need to win one, because perhaps we only need to remind them what we are." The council members looked at her with interest because Sarah Chun was not known for speaking without purpose. She stood and walked to the holographic display at the center of the room and activated it with a gesture. The display showed a ship unlike anything humanity had ever built before, because it was not designed to fight in the way that Concord vessels fought. It was designed to survive. "This is Project Prometheus," she said, "and it is the answer to a question that no one in the galaxy has asked in 10,000 years. What happens when you corner a Deathworlder?" The ship was called the Harbinger, and it was being built in secret in the asteroid belt, where the rocks provided cover and the distances provided safety from prying eyes. It was not large by galactic standards because Concord battleships stretched for kilometers, while the Harbinger was barely 300 meters from bow to stern. But size was not its purpose. The hull was made of materials that had been tested in the crushing depths of Earth's oceans, where the pressure would flatten any Concorde vessel like paper, and in the hearts of active volcanoes, where the heat would melt their finest alloys. The engines were built around a miniaturized singularity drive that could accelerate the ship to speeds that Concorde sensors would struggle to track, because it used principles that their comfortable scientists had never bothered to explore. And at the heart of the ship was something that was not a weapon at all. It was a message. Captain Marcus Chun was no relation to Admiral Sarah Chun, but he shared her calm determination and her absolute refusal to accept defeat. He had been selected to command the Harbinger because he had a quality that the selection committee valued above all others. He was a survivor 20 years ago. His submarine had been trapped beneath the Arctic ice for 63 days after a reactor malfunction, and he had kept his crew alive through conditions that should have killed them all. He had rationed food and recycled water and maintained morale through sheer force of will, and when rescue finally came, the rescue team had found his crew weak but alive and working together like a family. The Concorde did not understand what it meant to survive, because their species had forgotten that lesson long ago. Marcus stood in the construction bay and watched as workers in heavy suits welded the final hull plates into place, and he thought about the mission that awaited him. His orders were simple in concept but terrifying in execution. He was to take the Harbinger directly to the DOD command station, which was the most heavily defended installation in the known galaxy, and he was to breach their defenses and deliver humanity's message, not by destroying the station, because that would start a war humanity could not win, but by proving that they could destroy it if they chose to. The crew he selected was small because the Harbinger needed only 30 people to operate, and every one of them was a Deathworlder in the truest sense of the word. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka had grown up on the slopes of Mount Fuji, where earthquakes and volcanic activity were simply part of daily life, and she had learned to stay calm when the ground itself tried to kill her. Sergeant Boris Volkov had served in the Siberian ranges, where temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze solid in seconds, and he had learned to function in conditions that would shut down the bodies of softer species. Dr. Amara Okonkwo had worked in field hospitals during 3 African civil wars, and she had learned to perform surgery with limited supplies while bullets flew overhead, and she never lost a patient to panic. Every member of the crew had a story like this, because humanity was a species that produced such people in abundance, while the Concorde had forgotten how to make them. The payload the Harbinger carried was not nuclear warheads or antimatter bombs or any of the weapons that the Concorde feared. It was data stored in the ship's computers, was the complete history of human warfare from the first stone tools used to crack skulls to the nuclear fires that had nearly ended civilization. It contained records of every plague that humanity had survived and every ice age they had endured and every mass extinction they had outlasted. It showed how humans had hunted mammoths with nothing but pointed sticks and courage, and how they had tamed wolves and horses and cattle and bent nature itself to their will. And at the end of all, this data was a simple message recorded by Ambassador Elena Vasquez herself. We tried mercy, and you rejected it, so now we will show you what we are, and you will decide if you want to see more. The Harbinger launched on a cold Tuesday morning with no ceremony and no fanfare, because secrecy was essential, and the Concorde could not know what was coming. Marcus sat in the captain's chair and felt the ship around him like a living thing that was eager to run, and he thought about the 40,000 people who had died on the Horizon's dream. He thought about the children who would never see the stars they had been promised, and the families who would never build the homes they had dreamed of. And he thought about Admiral Vethkon, sitting in his comfortable office, deciding that human lives did not matter enough to disrupt the precious stability of his perfect, peaceful galaxy. The Harbinger accelerated toward Concord space, and the stars blurred into lines of light as the Singularity Drive pushed them faster than any human vessel had ever traveled before. They were not going to ask for justice anymore. They were going to demand it. The Harbinger crossed into Concord space at a velocity that made the border patrol stations question their own sensors, because nothing was supposed to move that fast. Lieutenant Commander Threll of the Concord Border Fleet stared at his display and blinked his 4 eyes rapidly as he tried to understand what he was seeing. A single ship was burning through their territory like a meteor, and it was not responding to any communication attempts, and it was heading directly toward the Galactic core where the DOD command station orbited a dying star. He sent an alert to his superiors, and within minutes the entire Concord Defense Network was aware that something unprecedented was happening. Admiral Vethcon received the report in his office, and his crystalline body hummed with a frequency that indicated concern because he recognized the energy signature of the approaching vessel. It was human. He ordered 3 patrol groups to intercept the ship and destroy it before it could penetrate deeper into Concord space, because whatever the Deathworlders were planning could not be allowed to succeed. The first patrol group consisted of 12 cruisers, each one larger than the Harbinger, and armed with weapons that could crack small moons and crewed by beings who had trained for centuries in the art of space combat. They positioned themselves in a standard intercept formation and locked their targeting systems onto the approaching human vessel and prepared to reduce it to atoms. But Captain Marcus Chun had been expecting this. The Harbinger did not slow down or change course or attempt to communicate, because Marcus knew that words were useless now and only actions would matter. Instead, the ship began to move in ways that the Concord cruisers could not predict, because Marcus was not flying by computer algorithm like they were. He was flying by instinct. The techniques he used had been developed in the crushing darkness of Earth's ocean depths, where submarines hunted each other in a deadly game of cat and mouse, and where the difference between life and death was measured in split-second decisions. He threw the Harbinger into a dive that took them dangerously close to a gas giant's gravity. Well, and the Concord cruisers hesitated because their computers warned them that following would risk structural damage. Marcus did not hesitate because Deathworlders did not have the luxury of hesitation. The Harbinger whipped around the planet, using its gravity like a slingshot, and emerged on a trajectory that the patrol group had not anticipated, and before they could reposition, Marcus was past them and accelerating toward the next obstacle. The second patrol group learned from the first and spread their ships wide to create a net that the Harbinger could not evade. But Marcus had expected this too. He flew directly at the center of their formation, and the Concord captain smiled because the foolish human had trapped himself. But at the last moment, the Harbinger plunged into an asteroid field that the Concord vessels could not enter because their shields were not designed for constant impacts, and their hulls were not built to survive the grinding violence of stone against metal. Marcus threaded his ship through gaps that should not have existed and scraped against rocks that should have torn them apart, and his crew worked in conditions that the best of Concord would have called impossible. Lieutenant Tanaka managed the navigation systems while the ship shook so hard that her teeth rattled, and Sergeant Volkov kept the engines running through damage that would have shut down any Concord vessel, and Dr. Okonkwo treated injuries as they happened without complaint or pause. They emerged from the asteroid field with their hull scarred and their shields depleted, but they were alive. And the second patrol group was behind them, unable to follow word spread through the Concord communication networks faster than the Harbinger itself traveled. The humans are not stopping. The humans cannot be stopped. Admiral Vethcon watched the reports with growing unease because he had studied humans since the day they first appeared in Concord space, and he knew things about them that most of his species had never bothered to learn. He knew that humans had evolved as persistent hunters on their deadly world, which meant they did not chase prey by being faster or stronger, but by simply never giving up. They would follow an animal for days without rest, eating while they walked and sleeping in shifts until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and then they would kill it and eat it and move on to the next hunt. The Concorde had never faced an enemy like this, because all their wars had been fought by species who understood the concept of acceptable losses and strategic withdrawal. Humans did not seem to understand these concepts at all. The third patrol group was the largest, yet consisting of 30 ships arranged in a formation that covered every possible approach vector and backed by weapons platforms that could destroy anything short of a capital ship. Marcus looked at the display and saw what awaited them, and for the first time since the mission began, he felt something like doubt. But then he thought about the children on the horizon's dream, and the doubt burned away like morning fog under a harsh sun. He turned to his crew and saw fear in their eyes, but also determination and trust in something that looked very much like eagerness. "We are going through," he said, and his voice was calm and steady, as if he was discussing the weather. The Harbinger accelerated directly toward the center of the formation and the Concorde. Ships opened fire with everything they had. The first volley should have destroyed them, but the Harbinger's hull absorbed the energy and converted it into heat. That was vented through specialized systems while the ship kept moving. The second volley cracked their outer armor and sent shrapnel flying through compartments, and 3 crew members were injured before a Concorde could reach them. The third volley breached the hull in 2 places, and suddenly Volkov was working in near vacuum with his suit sealed and his breath fogging his visor while he manually rerouted power systems that the damage had disrupted. Any Concorde crew would have died or surrendered, or at least slowed down to assess the damage, but the Harbinger kept accelerating, because Marcus Chen had given an order, and his crew would follow it into the heart of a star if necessary. They punched through the formation, leaving confused and damaged Concorde ships in their wake, and Marcus allowed himself one small moment of satisfaction before focusing on what came next. The DOD command station was now visible on their sensors. It was enormous and ancient, and protected by a defense grid that had never been breached in 10,000 years of galactic history, and they were going to fly right through it. The DOD command station hung in space like a monument to power and permanence, and Admiral Vethkon stood before its primary viewport, watching the approaching human vessel with something he had not felt in 2,000 years: fear. The defense grid surrounding the station was the most sophisticated system the Concorde had ever built, and it consisted of 12 layers of automated weapons platforms and energy shields and sensor networks that could detect a single atom moving through its protected space. No enemy had ever penetrated past the third layer, because no enemy had ever been insane enough to keep trying after experiencing what the first 2 layers could do. The Harbinger hit the first layer at full speed, and the weapons platforms opened fire with enough energy to glass a continent. Marcus felt the ship shudder as impacts that should have vaporized them were absorbed by the hole his engineers had designed, and he watched the damage indicators climb toward critical levels while his crew worked to keep them flying. The first layer fell behind them, and the second layer was worse because it combined weapons fire with gravity manipulation that tried to tear the ship apart from the inside. Lieutenant Tanaka screamed as her console exploded in a shower of sparks, and she was thrown from her chair, but she crawled back to her station with blood running down her face and kept working because the mission was not over and she was not dead yet. The artificial gravity failed completely, and suddenly everyone was floating while the ship tumbled through the weapons fire, and Marcus had to navigate by pure instinct because his instruments were giving him contradictory readings. Sergeant Volkov pulled himself hand over hand through corridors that were filling with smoke and found the gravity generator and saw that it was damaged beyond repair. So he did something that would have been considered impossible by any Concorde engineer. He rerouted power from the life support systems and used the emergency thrusters to create a spinning motion that simulated gravity through centrifugal force, and suddenly his crewmates could stand again. The second layer fell behind them, and the third layer was waiting. This layer was different because it did not try to destroy the ship, but instead attempted to disable it through targeted strikes at critical systems. The engines took a direct hit, and power dropped to 40%. The shields took another hit and failed completely. A whole breach opened in the medical bay, and Dr. Okonkwo was sucked toward it by the escaping atmosphere, but she grabbed a support beam and held on with strength that surprised even her, while one of her assistants sealed the breach with emergency foam. The fourth layer and the fifth and the sixth passed in a blur of damage and desperation, and by the time they reached the seventh layer, the Harbinger was more scar tissue than ship. Half the crew was injured and 3 were dead, and Marcus had taken shrapnel to his shoulder that Dr. Okonkwo had removed with nothing but local anesthetic and steady hands while the ship lurched around them. But they were still moving. Admiral Vethkon watched with disbelief as the human vessel breached the 8th layer and then the 9th, and he began to understand something that his comfortable existence had never taught him. These creatures did not know how to give up. He had read reports about human endurance, and he had seen footage of their survival challenges, but he had always assumed it was exaggeration or propaganda, because no species could actually function the way humans seemed to function. Now he was watching them do the impossible in real time, and he felt his certainty crumbling like old stone. The 10th layer and the 11th, and finally the 12th, fell behind the Harbinger as it emerged from the defense grid, trailing atmosphere and debris, and looking like it had been chewed up and spit out by a cosmic monster. It came to rest 500 meters from the primary viewport of the DOD command station, and hung there in space like a wounded animal that refused to die. Marcus looked through his own viewport and saw Admiral Vethkan standing on the other side, and for a long moment the two commanders simply stared at each other across the void. Then Marcus activated the broadcast system and transmitted on every frequency that the Concorde used. "We could have armed this ship," he said, and his voice was carried to every vessel and every station and every planet in the Concorde communication network. "We did not. This time." The data package began transmitting automatically, and suddenly every screen on the command station was showing images of human history. Wars that had killed millions, and plagues that had killed more, and ice ages that had driven humanity to the edge of extinction, and volcanic eruptions that had blotted out the sun. And through it all, humans had survived and adapted and grown stronger. The final image was Ambassador Vasquez, and her message was simple: investigate the massacre of the Horizons. Dream and prosecute those responsible, or the next vessel will not carry a message. We'll carry our fury. Admiral Vethkan looked at the battered human ship and then looked at the defense grid that had been breached for the first time in 10,000 years, and he understood that everything had changed. The humans had not come to destroy his station. They had come to prove that they could, and the next time they came, they would not show such restraint. He turned to his aide and gave an order that would reshape the political landscape of the entire galaxy: release the investigation files on the Horizons Dream incident, all of them. The galaxy held its breath for 3 standard days while the Harbinger floated silently before the DOD command station and diplomatic channels, burned with frantic communication. No one knew what to do, because nothing like this had ever happened before, and the rules that had governed galactic civilization for 12,000 years suddenly seemed inadequate for a situation that those rules had never anticipated. Admiral Vethkan released the investigation files as he had promised, and the truth spread through the Concorde like fire through dry grass. The Vreth Consortium had destroyed the Horizons Dream using military-grade weapons that could only have come from their official fleet, and they had done so deliberately to prevent human expansion into territory they wanted to control. The evidence was undeniable, and the Vreth representatives scrambled to explain and justify and minimize. But the images of 40,000 dead colonists, including 12,000 children, made their explanations sound hollow, and cruel species that had been allied with the Vreth for thousands of years began to distance themselves because the crime was too public and too obvious to ignore, and because they had all seen what the humans had done to the defense grid. If the Deathworlders could breach the most secure installation in the galaxy with a single ship, what else could they do if properly motivated? The Concord Assembly convened an emergency session, and for the first time in its history, it voted to impose sanctions on a senior member species. The Vreth Consortium was stripped of its military privileges and forced to pay reparations to humanity, and required to surrender the officials who had ordered the attack for trial. It was not enough to bring back the dead, but it was more than humanity had dared to hope for when Ambassador Vasquez had walked out of this same chamber 3 months ago with nothing but broken faith. Captain Marcus Chen and his surviving crew were retrieved by a human vessel that had been waiting at the edge of Concord space, and they were taken home as heroes. The Harbinger itself remained where it had stopped because no one wanted to touch it, and no one wanted to move it, and eventually, the Concord officially designated it as a navigational hazard, which was their way of admitting they did not know what else to call it. But unofficially, it became something more. Younger species, who had joined the Concord in recent millennia, began making pilgrimages to see the ship that had done the impossible, and they looked at its scarred hull and its broken systems, and they saw hope. They saw proof that the old powers were not invincible, and that courage and determination could overcome technology in numbers and millennia of accumulated advantage. The Harbinger became a symbol of defiance that the Concord could not suppress, because suppressing it would only make it more powerful. Ambassador Elena Vasquez returned to the Concord Assembly 6 months after the Harbinger incident, and this time the chamber was very different. Representatives who had ignored her before now watched her with careful attention, and species that had dismissed humanity as irrelevant. Newcomers now treated them as equals. She walked to the central podium and stood in the same place where she had begged for justice and been denied, and she looked out at the faces of beings who had learned a lesson they would never forget. She did not speak of revenge or punishment or the satisfaction of seeing the Vreth brought low. Instead, she spoke of the future. Humanity came to the stars hoping to find friends, she said, and we found a galaxy that did not want us and did not trust us and did not care when our children were murdered. We could have responded with war, and we chose not to because we know what war costs better than any species in this chamber. We have fought each other for thousands of years, and we have learned that victory is often more expensive than defeat, and that enemies today can become allies tomorrow. The Harbinger was not an attack. It was a warning and an invitation. We are dangerous, and we will not apologize for that because our world made us what we are, and we cannot change our nature any more than you can change yours. But we are also capable of mercy and cooperation and friendship. If you give us a reason to show these qualities, the choice is yours. The Assembly voted to grant humanity full membership with all the rights and privileges that entailed, and they voted to give humanity the Kepler Expanse territories that Elena had been fighting for since the beginning. It was not generosity that motivated them because the Concord did not operate on generosity. It was respect and something very close to fear. Admiral Vethcon watched the vote from his office on the command station, and he felt something he had not experienced in 2,000 years of existence. He felt old. The galaxy he had known was changing, and the comfortable certainties that had guided his career were crumbling, and he did not know what would replace them, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. The Deathworlders had reminded the galaxy of a truth that had been forgotten for 10,000 years. Peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice and mercy. It was not weakness, but a gift that the strong gave to those who deserved it. Humanity had tried mercy first, and the Concord had rejected it, and so humanity had shown them what came next. They had shown them the iron beneath the soft words, and the fire beneath the patient diplomacy, and the predator that lurked behind the smile. And the galaxy would never forget. Years later, historians would debate whether the Harbinger incident was the moment humanity truly became a galactic power, or simply the moment the other species realized what humans had always been. But the crew of the Harbinger never concerned themselves with such questions. They had done their duty, and they had survived, and they had changed the course of history with nothing but a damaged ship and the stubborn refusal to accept that they were beaten. That was what it meant to be a Deathworlder. That was what it meant to be human, and the galaxy had finally learned to respect it.